Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can talk about Joe Biden and personal space. So just to be clear here, I'm not diagnosing Joe Biden, just looking at the behavior that we can see, what's observable, and giving my thoughts on it. Now, Joe Biden was the senator for the state of Delaware and the vice president of the United States. And of course, I live in Delaware, but I've never met Joe Biden. Sometimes I feel like the only Delawarean who hasn't. I know a number of people who have met him, and most people say they like him as a person. Now, in addition to not diagnosing him, I'm also not offering any commentary on his political ideology. Right, so I'm kind of staying away from that whole area. Now, I think when many people think of Joe Biden, other than his political position and what he's achieved as a politician, there's a few other characteristics that come to mind, and these are kind of tied in with what I'm going to talk about in terms of personal space. He's been known to have the tendency to kind of blurt things out. Some of these things are offensive, and even when they're not offensive, a lot of times they're just not funny. So it appears he has a poor filter. Now, to be fair, he's not the only politician who has a poor filter. I would say there's actually quite a few in the same position. But again, this kind of ties in with the issue of personal space and boundaries. There's this sense when looking at the photographs and the video evidence about Joe Biden that he has kind of a touchy-feely dilemma going on, right? A touchy-feely problem, that he's a bit handsy. So specifically with Joe Biden, we see that he puts his hands on people's shoulders. He tends to touch his nose against people, sometimes their nose, but just touch his nose against them in general. And sometimes he smells their hair, which is, for me, probably one of the most unusual behaviors that I've seen there in terms of the videos I've seen of him. He also tends to kiss people a lot and hug people a lot, and there are allegations that he's done more than that. If we look at just, again, the video and photographic evidence, we see quite a bit of support for the hugging, the kissing, the smelling of the hair, the hands on the shoulders, a lot of these different behaviors. Now, recently, Joe Biden apologized for this, essentially saying that he's aware of his behavior. It's kind of who he is. He kind of made that argument that it's kind of how he has been wired or how he's wired. He'll be more careful. I think his exact words were he'll be more mindful and respectful of people's personal space. So this is interesting because, in a way, he's saying it, you get this sense that this is the first time he's ever been told this, but I think more accurately, maybe it's the first time he's ever taken it seriously. So if you think about a long political career like that, he certainly had time to learn this, and it's fairly easy to stop. I'm not sure I really buy the argument that it's personality as opposed to behavior. I think hugging and kissing people and touching their shoulders and smelling their hair, clearly that's behavioral, and there may be personality characteristics that make that easier, that facilitate that behavior, but personality and behavior can be separated. So to give an example, if somebody's low on extroversion, if they're not extroverted, they're introverted, and you say to them, well, be more friendly. Well, that's mostly a personality thing. Somebody can't be more friendly very easily if they're not wired to be friendly. If you say to somebody who's low in agreeableness, you need to trust people more. Well, trust is a complex construct. It's not just a matter of a series of behaviors. The same thing with the personality trait openness to experience. If somebody doesn't have a lot of imagination and you say, look, you need to be more imaginative, I don't know how they would do that. But behavior is a lot more clear, right? If you had a box in front of you and there were two buttons on this box, and the button on the left was painted green and it says, press this for $1 million, and the button on the right is painted red and it says, press this and you lose $1 million, right? So it's a clear choice. You can either not press either button, you could press both buttons, which I guess would put you at 0, or you could press the $1 million or the lose $1 million button. Most people, I think, would be able and would want to press the gain $1 million button on the left and avoid any contact at all with the lose $1 million button on the right. So it's behavioral. Your personality may play a role in how you feel about that. For example, some people might be very excited that they have this opportunity for the $1 million, so they may have trouble kind of calming their nerves, but again, they could still press that green button and avoid that red one. So personality and behavior overlap, but again, I really don't like the argument that somebody's kind of hardwired and they have to be touchy-feely. Now again, we see with Joe Biden that he's apologized and he's made it clear that he's going to try to change this behavior in the future, so we'll have to see what happens with that. So another question on this topic is, why is this so important, right? Joe Biden's just one person. Well, of course, he is just one person, and one person can do damage, but it's unlikely that he's going to cause a tremendous amount of damage through his behavior, right? In terms of he won't be affecting millions of people because he's touching them. He just can't touch that many people. I think it speaks to a larger issue, though, right? About personal space and boundaries. And of course, there are some cultural differences with how people approach this issue, but in general, I think that people know that we need to respect personal space. There's just a limit to what people want to do in terms of physical encounters with other people. And there are reasons that people are uncomfortable with this behavior. I think sometimes people think of it as a prelude to harassment or assault, and of course sometimes it can be, so that's certainly a legitimate concern. But other people just don't like it, right? They're just not comfortable with it. It's not appropriate for them. Even if they feel safe, even if they're not worried about harassment or assault, the act itself feels like a violation of expectations and a violation of a boundary. It's really not about this idea that physical contact is always wrong. That's not true. Physical contact isn't really what's wrong here in this situation. It's that it can communicate that someone has power. I think that's one of the major reasons that people don't like the physical contact all the time, or some people don't like it at all. It's really a question of establishing power over another person. And that makes this physical contact, personal space issue more about a question of consent. It's not that physical contact is bad, it's that people need permission to make contact. So I've heard this argument before, and I can appreciate this, that the world is becoming a cold place, right? As we avoid physical contact more and more with situations like this, that the world is getting more cold and people are getting more isolated. And I agree, there's a sad component to all this, right? There's a component to all this that makes it feel like people are growing more distant from one another. But I don't think it has to be sad. I don't think that physical contact is helpful without consent. So it can certainly be helpful with consent. It's just, again, comes back to permission. It's not a matter of the world being a cold place or physical contact being bad or evil. Yes, I think that values are changing, and whenever this happens, there are pros and cons, right? There are certain attributes of this kind of change that are good, and some that aren't as good. But overall, I think that consent makes sense, and I think that if we could work out a system of communicating a little more clearly about personal space and boundaries, that people would be more comfortable with that. So here's where this becomes problematic for somebody like Joe Biden. He's a politician. So he could have contact with hundreds of people in the span of an hour. So getting permission from each one is really functionally impossible, right? Are we supposed to see like Secret Service agents standing with clipboards as people come up and saying, hey, are you okay if Joe Biden hugs you? How about kisses you? How about smelling your hair? I mean, it's just not feasible. At some level, I don't think there's anything left for Joe Biden to do except for not invading personal space. He could extend his hand for a handshake, and then if somebody moves in to hug him, he could give him a hug if he wants. That's okay, because somebody's really saying that they consent to that if they move in for the hug. But in terms of where that interaction starts, it really can't start with a politician moving out and trying to hug somebody. There has to be consent. And I realize that in the world of politics, when you meet a lot of people and everything, that becomes more difficult. But again, I don't really see any way around this issue. The last point I'll cover here about personal space is how interesting I find it in terms of how people can be so different on this issue, right? We see different extremes. I've seen people that were extremely sensitive to physical contact. They didn't even want to shake hands. They didn't want to even get within 2 or 3 feet of another person. So absolutely no physical contact. On the other side of it, we see people that are even more extreme than Joe Biden in terms of how comfortable they are and how often they initiate physical contact. So some people are very concerned with it, and other people don't seem to be as concerned, or they're not as aware. As a mental health professional, I tend to fall on the more toward no contact side of that. Not extreme, but just more in that direction. For example, I don't mind shaking hands, not at all. If somebody reaches out and like touches my arm, that usually doesn't really bother me too much. Anything beyond that, though, does feel kind of like somebody's moving in on boundaries. Now, if they ask, that's different, of course. But if somebody does that without asking, yeah, I get a little worried about that. I think because in my profession, boundaries are really crucial. So I'm really probably quite biased by my profession. So we learn in counseling that it's important to keep distance and boundaries correct, to manage them correctly, not to get too close, but also not to get too far away. So a lot of things, of course, can be said verbally, and I'm okay with a lot of different types of verbal exchanges, but I'd rather keep the physical touching to a minimum. And I think that most counselors, to some extent, are probably fairly close in terms of the way they think about physical contact. Now, of course, I have seen exceptions. I've seen counselors that every client that comes in, they give them a hug and all that. But I'm sure, or at least I hope, that that was prearranged, that there was consent. And I've seen many more, I think, that kind of fall into my mindset, which is I'm okay when it's consensual. But at the same time, in a formal setting, I think we just have to be careful about how often we give consent, right? So one question I get a lot from counselors who are in training is, what happens if a client wants to hug you? Well, I think each counselor has to make that decision for themselves. Now, if they're asking for the hug and you consent, of course, that's generally okay, but you also have to consider what's happened with the client, where that relationship is, are there any other boundary problems? There's a lot of factors that counselors have to take into account that, like a politician, wouldn't have to worry about. So I think that in terms of comparing like my style to the style of a politician, there's a lot of factors that you'd really have to look at. There's so many things that would be quite different from a formal professional setting and a more informal kind of situation where somebody's greeting a lot of people. I think that one thing that all counselors could agree on is that physical contact communicates something. And you do have to be careful about what you're communicating. So it's not necessarily always communicating something negative, of course, but it is a form of communication and it means something. And maybe from all this with Joe Biden, all this discussion we see around being handsy and touchy-feely, maybe we can learn something about boundaries and personal space that's valuable. And I think that out of this, I hope something good will come. I hope this isn't really just something where it's a negative and people look at this and say, well, Joe Biden is bad or evil or whatever. I don't think he's bad or evil. I think he has a tendency that can make some people uncomfortable. And I think it's important to learn from that. And I hope that he makes the adjustments that he says he's going to make. Now, I know whenever I talk about personal space and boundaries and things like that, there are going to be a variety of opinions. If you agree or disagree with me on any of my points or have other opinions, please put those in the comment section. As always, I hope you found this discussion of personal space and boundaries to be interesting. Thanks for watching.